Leo Martinez wiped the grease from his hands with a stained dish towel, the familiar sizzle of the grill behind him filling the cramped kitchen of Danny's diner. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the worn linoleum floor. It was another Tuesday night in downtown Phoenix, and the dinner rush was winding down to its usual collection of late-shift workers, truckers, and insomniacs seeking refuge in bottomless coffee and greasy comfort food. He'd been working the line at Danny's for 3 years now, ever since he dropped out of community college when his mom got sick. The pay was barely enough to cover rent on his studio apartment and keep his beat-up Honda running, but Leo had dreams that stretched far beyond the confines of this kitchen. He'd sketched out business plans on napkins during his breaks, researching food truck permits and calculating startup costs on his cracked phone screen. The diner's front door chimed, and Leo glanced through the pass-through window to see 3 women settling into the corner booth. One of them caught his eye immediately, tall, blonde, wearing a crisp white blouse that probably cost more than Leo made in a week. Her name was Clara, and she'd been coming in occasionally for about a month, usually with different groups of friends from what looked like some upscale office downtown. Leo had noticed her before. How could he not? She carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about making rent or choosing between groceries and gas money. But there was something about the way she laughed, genuine and uninhibited, that made him think maybe she wasn't just another stuck-up rich girl. Danny, the owner, nudged Leo with his elbow. "Stop staring and get back to work, Romeo. We got orders backing up." Leo turned back to the grill, flipping burgers and dropping fries into the oil. But he kept stealing glances at Clara's table, watching as she animated her conversation with gestures that made her jewelry catch the light. When their waitress Marie brought their order to the kitchen, Leo made sure everything was perfect. The burger cooked exactly medium, the fries golden and crispy, the lettuce and tomatoes fresh. "Tell them it's on the house," Leo said quietly, handing Marie the plates. Marie raised an eyebrow. "Danny's gonna have your ass if he finds out you're giving away free food again." "Just this once," Leo said. "I'll cover it from my tips." 20 minutes later, as Clara and her friends were finishing their meal, Leo worked up the courage to step out from behind the kitchen. He'd changed into a clean shirt and combed his hair back, hoping to make a better impression than his usual grease-stained appearance. He approached their table with what he hoped was casual confidence. "Evening, ladies. Hope everything was good tonight." Clara looked up, and for a moment, Leo felt a spark of connection. Her green eyes were warm, curious, but then her gaze traveled over his appearance, the cheap polo shirt, the lingering smell of the fryer that clung to his skin, the nervous energy that marked him as someone who didn't belong in her world. "Oh," she said, her voice carrying just enough surprise to sting. "You're the cook." "That's right," Leo said, trying to maintain his smile. "I actually wanted to ask you something. I've noticed you come in here pretty regularly, and I was wondering if maybe you'd like to grab coffee sometime. Somewhere that doesn't smell like French fry oil." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Clara's friends exchanged glances, and Leo could see the exact moment when polite interest shifted to something else entirely. Clara's expression hardened, not cruel exactly, but dismissive in a way that cut deeper than outright meanness. "Look," she said, her voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "You seem like a nice guy, but I don't date people who smell like grease. I mean, what would we even talk about? Your shift schedule?" The laughter from her friends hit Leo like a physical blow. Not malicious laughter, but the kind of casual amusement that comes from watching someone reach too far above their station. The woman to Clara's left, a redhead with designer glasses, added with a giggle, "At least he's ambitious, Clara. Most line cooks don't even try." Leo stood there for what felt like an eternity, his face burning with embarrassment. The other diners were staring now, some with pity, others with the uncomfortable satisfaction of watching someone else's humiliation. Marie caught his eye from behind the counter, her expression a mixture of sympathy and second-hand embarrassment. "Right," Leo managed, his voice surprisingly steady. "Well, enjoy your evening." He turned and walked back to the kitchen, each step feeling like it took tremendous effort. Behind him, he could hear Clara's voice, slightly louder than necessary. "God, I hate when they do that. Like, read the room, you know?" The rest of Leo's shift passed in a blur of mechanized cooking and cleaning. He moved through the motions automatically, his mind replaying the scene over and over, each repetition making the sting sharper. When closing time finally came, he found himself alone in the kitchen, staring at his reflection in the steel surface of the walk-in freezer. The man looking back at him wore defeat like an ill-fitting uniform. His hair was disheveled, his shirt stained with the evidence of 8 hours over a hot grill. But it wasn't just his appearance that bothered him. It was the resignation in his eyes, the acceptance of limitations he'd never consciously agreed to. Leo drove home through empty streets, his Honda's engine making the wheezing sound that meant another expensive repair was coming soon. His apartment building squatted between a laundromat and a check-cashing place, its brown stucco facade cracked and faded. He climbed the narrow stairs to his second-floor unit, fumbling with keys that stuck in a lock that needed replacing. Inside, the studio apartment felt smaller than usual. A fold-out bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a card table that served as both desk and dining room. On the table sat a stack of notebooks filled with his business ideas, sketches of food truck designs, and calculations of how much money he'd need to make his dreams reality. Next to them, a pile of bills reminded him how far he was from having any extra money for dreams. Leo sat on the edge of his bed and pulled out his phone, scrolling through social media until he found Clara's profile. Her life was displayed in a carefully curated collection of images: rooftop bars, weekend trips to Sedona, expensive dinners at restaurants where Leo could never afford to eat. Her latest post was from earlier that evening, a selfie with her friends at Danny's diner with the caption, "Slumming it with the girls at this dive downtown. The food's actually not terrible." He stared at the screen until his eyes burned, then set the phone aside and lay back on his narrow bed. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor's television and the distant hum of traffic from the interstate. This was his life, invisible, disposable, defined by other people's low expectations. But somewhere in the darkness of that small room, something shifted. The humiliation began to crystallize into something harder, more focused. Leo had always been the kind of person who absorbed criticism, who tried to adjust himself to fit other people's comfort zones. But Clara's words had stripped away the pretense, forced him to see himself through her eyes, and he didn't like what he saw. The next morning, Leo arrived at Danny's 30 minutes early, as usual. But instead of going straight to the kitchen, he sat in his car and called the number he'd been staring at for months on a crumpled business card. "Martinez Food Concepts," answered a gravelly voice. "This is Carlos." "Hi, Mr. Martinez," Leo said, his heart pounding. "This is Leo Martinez. We talked a few months ago about the food truck opportunity." Carlos Martinez wasn't family, despite the shared name. He was a local entrepreneur who owned 3 successful food trucks and was looking for a partner to help launch a 4th. He'd eaten at Danny's one night around 2 in the morning, complimenting Leo's cooking and leaving his card with an offer to talk business. Leo had been too scared to call, worried about taking risks when he could barely afford his current life. "Leo, right, the kid who makes those killer breakfast burritos. I was wondering if you'd ever call." They met that afternoon at a coffee shop in Scottsdale, Carlos arriving in a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had seen better decades. He was in his 50s, weathered and practical, with the kind of handshake that suggested he'd built his success through work rather than luck. "Here's the deal," Carlos said, spreading papers across the small table. "I've got the truck, I've got the permits, I've got the routes mapped out. What I need is someone who can cook and who's hungry enough to work 18-hour days until we get established. You interested in hungry?" Leo looked at the business plan, the projected earnings, the contract that would make him a partner rather than an employee. It meant giving up the security of his steady paycheck, investing his meager savings, and betting everything on his ability to succeed at something he'd only dreamed about. "When do we start?" he said. The food truck was a converted Airstream trailer painted bright red with Fuego Mobile scripted across the side in orange flames. It was cramped, efficient, and beautiful, in the way that purely functional things could be. Carlos taught Leo the routes: construction sites for breakfast, office complexes for lunch, late-night spots for the bar crowd. More importantly, he taught him the business side: inventory management, social media marketing, customer relationships. "Food trucks aren't restaurants," Carlos explained as they prepped for their first day. "We're not just selling food, we're selling an experience. People want to feel like they discovered something special, like they're part of something exclusive. You make them feel that way, and they'll follow you anywhere. Leo threw himself into the work with the intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose. He was up at 4 in the morning, prepping ingredients and planning routes. He spent his afternoons studying social media strategies and his evenings developing new recipes. The work was harder than anything he'd done at Danny's, but it was his work, building something that belonged to him. The first month was brutal. Long days in the Arizona heat, equipment breakdowns, permit issues, and the constant stress of uncertain income. Leo's savings evaporated, and he found himself eating ramen and peanut butter sandwiches to stretch every dollar. But slowly, steadily, Fuego Mobile began to build a following. It started with the construction crews, who appreciated Leo's generous portions and reasonable prices. Then word spread to the office workers, drawn by Carlos's social media posts and Leo's willingness to customize orders. By the third month, they had regular customers who would follow the truck's location updates religiously, and Leo was earning more than he'd ever made at Danny's. Success bred success. Leo used his growing profits to improve the truck's equipment, expand the menu, and eventually hire part-time help. He studied business books during his rare free time, learning about branding, customer service, and financial management. Carlos, impressed by Leo's dedication and natural business instincts, gradually handed over more of the operations management. "You got that thing most people don't," Carlos told him one evening as they counted the day's receipts. "You understand that this isn't about you. It's about giving people something they didn't know they needed." By the end of his first year with Fuego Mobile, Leo had saved enough money to buy out Carlos's share of the business. The older man was ready to retire, and Leo was ready to take full control. He expanded to 2 trucks, then 3, building a small empire of mobile food service that catered to construction sites, office complexes, and special events across the Phoenix metro area. The work consumed him completely, which was exactly what he needed. Every successful day, every satisfied customer, every dollar in the bank was proof that Clara had been wrong about him. He wasn't trying to prove anything to her specifically. She rarely crossed his mind during the long days of building his business, but her words had crystallized something in him, a determination to never again be dismissed or diminished by someone else's narrow vision of who he could be. 2 years after that humiliating night at Danny's diner, Leo was driving through downtown Phoenix in his newly purchased BMW when he passed a familiar storefront. The diner looked smaller than he remembered, shabbier somehow, though probably nothing had actually changed. He parked across the street and sat in his car for a moment, watching the sparse dinner crowd through the windows. He could see Marie behind the counter, older now, her movements carrying the weight of another 2 years of serving coffee and taking orders. Danny was still working the grill, his broad back hunched over the same equipment Leo had operated for 3 years. It looked exactly like the life he'd left behind, which surprised him. Somehow, he'd expected it to have diminished in his memory, become smaller and less significant. Instead, it looked exactly like what it had always been, a hard, honest living that deserved respect. Leo walked through the front door, the familiar chime announcing his arrival. The smells hit him immediately. Coffee, bacon grease, the particular mixture of cleaning supplies and cooking oil that defined every diner in America. Marie looked up from wiping down the counter, and her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally a broad smile. "Leo Martinez," she said, loud enough to turn heads. "Look at you, all dressed up like a businessman." He was wearing dark jeans and a crisp button-down shirt, nothing fancy by most standards, but a far cry from the stained uniforms of his diner days. More than the clothes, though, he carried himself differently. Straighter, more confident, like someone who belonged wherever he chose to be. "Hey, Marie," he said, settling onto a stool at the counter. "How's everything?" "Same as always," she said, pouring him a cup of coffee without being asked. "Danny's in the back if you want to say hi. He'll be tickled to see you." They caught up for a few minutes, Marie filling him in on the usual diner gossip, which employees had quit, which regular customers had moved away or died, how business had been slow since the new shopping complex opened up north. Leo listened with genuine interest, surprised by how much he'd missed this simple human connection. "So what are you up to these days?" Marie asked. "Last we heard, you were working some food truck thing." "Still am," Leo said. "Actually, I own 3 trucks now. We're doing pretty well." Marie's eyebrows shot up. 3 trucks? Look at you, Mr. Entrepreneur." The conversation was interrupted by the front door chime, and Leo turned to see a familiar figure walking in. Clara looked exactly the same. Blonde hair perfectly styled, expensive clothes, that air of casual superiority that seemed as natural as breathing. She was alone this time, checking her phone as she walked to a booth near the window. Leo felt a strange mix of emotions watching her. The old anger was still there, but muted now, more like the memory of pain than pain itself. Mostly, he felt curious about how this encounter would play out, whether she would even remember him. She glanced up as she settled into the booth, her eyes passing over him without recognition, before focusing on the menu. Leo realized that he'd been invisible to her even when he was trying to get her attention. Of course she wouldn't recognize him now, out of context, and dressed like someone from her own social circle. Marie had noticed the direction of his gaze. "You know her?" "We met once," Leo said simply. He finished his coffee and left a $20 tip on a $5 check, the kind of gesture that had once been impossible but now felt natural. As he stood to leave, Clara looked up from her phone, and this time her gaze lingered. Leo could see the wheels turning. He looked familiar, but she couldn't place him. He walked over to her table, hands in his pockets, his expression neutral and friendly. "Clara, right?" he said. "We met a couple years ago." She looked up at him, her forehead creasing with the effort of remembering. "I'm sorry, I used to work here," Leo said. "I asked you out once. You told me you don't date people who smell like grease." The color drained from Clara's face as the memory clicked into place. She looked mortified, her mouth opening and closing without sound as she searched for something to say. "Oh my God," she finally managed. I remember. I'm so sorry, It was honest," Leo said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "Maybe not kind, but honest. I probably did smell like grease." Clara seemed to relax slightly, perhaps interpreting his calmness as forgiveness. "I was having a bad day, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. You were just being nice." "I was," Leo agreed. "But you were right about one thing. We probably wouldn't have had much to talk about back then." She smiled tentatively, sensing an opening. "What are you doing now? You look different." "I own a food truck company," Leo said. 3 trucks, actually. We cater events, work construction sites, office complexes. Business is good." Clara's expression shifted again, this time to something that looked like genuine interest mixed with surprise. "That's amazing. I mean, I never would have guessed. Not that you couldn't do it, just that you never really looked close enough to see what I might be capable of," Leo finished for her. She had the grace to look embarrassed. "That's fair. I was pretty shallow back then." "Back then?" Leo asked, raising an eyebrow. Clara laughed, a sound that was more nervous than amused. "Okay, I deserve that. Look, I really am sorry about what I said. It was cruel and unnecessary. I'd like to make it up to you somehow. Maybe we could get that coffee you mentioned?" Leo studied her face, seeing something he hadn't noticed before, a kind of desperate eagerness that suggested her life wasn't as perfect as her social media presence implied. He wondered what had changed, what circumstances had made her willing to reconsider someone she'd dismissed so completely before. "I appreciate the apology," he said finally, "but I don't think that coffee is a good idea." "Why not?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of the same dismissive surprise she'd shown years earlier, as if she couldn't quite believe someone was turning her down. Leo smiled, not unkindly, but without warmth. "Because you were right the first time, Clara. We don't have much to talk about. You made your choice about who I was worth getting to know. I've made mine about who's worth my time." He turned to leave, then paused and looked back at her. "For what it's worth, the food truck thing worked out better than I expected. Turns out people don't mind the smell of success." Leo walked out of Danny's diner for what he knew would be the last time, climbing into his BMW as Clara watched through the window. He didn't drive away immediately, instead sitting for a moment and looking at the building that had once defined the limits of his world. His phone buzzed with a text from his newest employee, asking about tomorrow's catering schedule for a tech company's quarterly meeting. Leo smiled as he typed back the details, thinking about how much his life had changed since the last time he'd sat in this parking lot, nursing wounded pride and uncertain dreams. As he pulled away from the curb, Leo caught a glimpse of Clara in his rearview mirror, still sitting in the booth, staring out the window with an expression he couldn't quite read. He wondered if she understood what had just happened, if she realized that some opportunities once lost don't come around again. The city lights of Phoenix stretched out before him as he drove home to his apartment in Scottsdale, a real apartment with a separate bedroom and a kitchen big enough to cook in. Tomorrow he'd be up early, prepping for another day of building something that belonged to him, serving people who valued what he had to offer. Leo Martinez had learned that the most satisfying revenge wasn't making someone pay for underestimating you. It was proving to yourself that their opinion had never mattered in the first place. The smell of grease had been washed away long ago, replaced by something much more valuable, the scent of a man who knew exactly what he was worth.